The photo that you're looking at is that of a young girl named Junko Furuta. And this is one of those rare instances where a case is actually known by the victim's name and not necessarily by the perpetrator. This case is not for the faint of heart, and you're going to hear things that will make you deeply uncomfortable and will make you question what humanity is truly capable of. And in some instances, it might make you lose faith in humanity altogether. Many have attributed that to just how horrific the details of this story are. Just to give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to discuss in today's video, Junko essentially spent 44 days in purgatory being tortured by a group of young boys for absolutely no reason. Alright guys, consider this a trigger warning. If this is not for you, click out of the video and just join me on the next one. Alright, let's get into today's story. So quickly before we get into the video, let me introduce myself. If you guys are new here, my name is Ashley and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. If you guys enjoy this type of content, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. All of it really does help. And again, don't forget to check out my TikTok. The link is in my description box below. Alright, so let's get into the tragic story of Junko Furuta. So today's story takes us to the Saitama Prefecture in Japan, just outside of Tokyo, where we meet Junko Furuta. She was born on January 18th, 1971, and also had an older brother and a younger brother, making her the middle child of 3. The year in question is 1988, and Junko was just 17 years old, attending high school. Now, by all accounts, she led a fairly normal life. She had friends, she was a straight-A student, she stayed out of trouble, and she also had a part-time job. Many students actually knew her and even called her a goody two-shoes or a good girl because she just always tried to do the right thing. She always tried to stay out of trouble or any sort of deviant behavior. However, being a shy, quiet, good girl ended up attracting the very opposite of who she was, which happened to be a boy named Hiroshi Miyano. Now, Hiroshi had a very long history of being a troublemaker, with reports saying that it went as far back as kindergarten. By this point, though, he wasn't just a school bully. In fact, he had ties to the criminal world and specifically to the Yakuza. Now, to give you a little bit of background on what the Yakuza is, essentially they are like the Italian mafia, but in Japan. They're known for their organized crime and participating in many other illegal activities and even hold power in politics. As tough and terrifying as these guys may appear, they are said to follow a very strict code of conduct that includes not harming innocent people or committing any sort of act that goes outside of chivalry. Doing so would result in punishment, and one example of these is that they are forced to cut off the tip of their pinky finger. And just a little fun fact, this is actually where the term pinky promise comes from. Now, although the Yakuza has this code of conduct where they're supposed to act in a particular way, it's safe to say that none of these individuals, especially Hiroshi, ever followed any of these rules. So back to how these two got involved. So one day at school, Hiroshi, he started to notice Junko and he was attracted to her, so he decided to ask her out. But Junko knew about his reputation. She didn't like that he was a bully and his overall vibe. So she ended up turning him down. And this is one of those things that is a little bit of a trigger. And it's very sad because this specific reason is exactly why so many women are afraid to say no. Even if you're being nice about it, some men out there are just not able to take rejection. And that's exactly what ended up happening with Hiroshi. He was not able to take this rejection, and in fact, he ended up coming back for vengeance. So to go into Hiroshi a little bit more, he did have this reputation of being a bad boy, but that particular image also did work for him. He was said to have been intimidating, and he always got his way, especially with women, and it was even said that he was never told no. So when Junko had the audacity to say no to him, it absolutely blew his mind, and that's what led to these circumstances that we're going to go into next. So on November 25th, Hiroshi and his friend Shinji Minato, who was just 16 at the time, were out and about. Shinji, unfortunately, had also fallen down the same criminal path as Hiroshi, and they had both created a pattern of committing regular crimes, including robbing people and SAing women just for fun. On that fateful day, the two teenagers were prowling the streets with the intention of kidnapping a woman for their own pleasure. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Junko unfortunately happened to be riding her bike right past both of these guys on her way home from her part-time job. This is when Hiroshi spotted her, and he quickly came up with a very devious plan, and both of the boys ended up putting this into action right away. Shinji, under the orders of Hiroshi, then walked up to where Junko was riding her bike and decided to just straight up push her off of her bike. Coincidentally, Hiroshi happened to see this all go down, and so he walked towards Junko, offered to help her, and even offered to walk her home so she got home safely. Junko was a little bit reluctant, but she also was a little bit spooked about what had just happened, so she said okay. But sadly, she didn't know that she had just made a huge mistake. So instead of walking her home, Hiroshi decided to take Junko to an abandoned warehouse where he proceeded to SA her. After he was done with her, he then took her to a nearby hotel where he proceeded to SA her again, and then called up several of his friends, Joe Ogura and Yasushi Watanabe, to brag about what he had just done to Junko, but also to ask for help. Around 3 a.m., Shinji then took Junko to a nearby park where his friends were waiting. That's when all of them started going through Junko's personal belongings. She had her backpack with her, and they had found a notebook of hers that had her family address on it. They then used this information to threaten Junko and to coerce her into obedience. They essentially said that if she didn't obey, then they would send the Yakuza after her family and make sure that all of them were destroyed. Not really having a choice, Junko essentially agreed. The group of boys then decided that they would take her to the home of Shinji and his family in an area known as Adachi in Tokyo. That's where all of the teenagers then proceeded to SA her again over and over again. And unbeknownst to Junko, this is the home where she would unknowingly spend the rest of her life. So again, unbeknownst to Junko's family, they were at home waiting for Junko to arrive home. They were basically expecting her to be there at any moment. But as each hour passed, they started to get a little bit more worried. After 2 days of waiting, her family finally called the police to report their daughter missing on November 27th, 1988. Somehow, Hiroshi and his friends caught wind of this, and that's when they came up with another plan. They then forced Junko to call her parents and tell them that she had decided to run away on her own and that she was staying with her friends. She also reassured her parents that she was fine, that she was completely safe, and to not worry about her because this is what she wanted. She then also demanded that her parents call off the entire police investigation because she just did not want to be found. Little did her family know, though, that this would be the last time that they would ever speak to Junko. Now, with the police not looking for her anymore, the group of gangsters now knew that Junko was essentially theirs to do with whatever they absolutely wanted to. It was basically a free-for-all. They then kept Junko locked inside a bedroom for 44 days, where she endured endless torture. She would be SA'd by these demonic individuals on a daily basis, and sometimes it would be multiple times a day. And even on one instance, it was reported that she was SA'd by 12 different men. In total, it was estimated that Junko had been SA'd by approximately 100 men over 400 times in those 44 days. Which also meant that over 100 men knew exactly about what was happening to Junko. They knew about her captivity. They knew about what was being done to her, but not a single one of them had the heart or the dignity to come forward and alert police. Now, this part, I think, is probably the one that upset me and shocked me the most, if that's even possible. Since the house belonged to the family of Shinji, they would obviously be around. And on one particular day, when they came back home, to their surprise, that's when they saw Junko for the first time. To explain the situation, Shinji told his family that Junko was his girlfriend. Initially, the family believed him, but they knew that there was something off about the situation. Then they discovered the awful truth, and instead of going for help, they decided to turn a blind eye. It was said that Shinji's family ignored the entire situation because they were afraid of the Yakuza. They were aware of Hiroshi's tie to the Yakuza, and so they were apparently terrified of calling the police because they knew exactly what would happen if they did so. They would also later go on to say that they were becoming extremely fearful of their son because he had become increasingly violent towards them. Once Hiroshi and his little gang of friends realized that no one was going to call the cops, even when the entire situation was right in front of their faces, they stopped trying to cover up the entire thing at all. On the 28th of November, Junko then made an attempt to escape while her captors were apparently high on multiple different substances. However, Hiroshi noticed this and was able to grab onto her legs and then dropped her onto the floor and then proceeded to put a pillow over her face in order to stop her screams. Shinji's parents, again, they heard the entire commotion, so when they came to investigate, they were essentially told to not worry about it, and just like that, the entire family ignored it and pretended like everything was absolutely fine. The group then went on to SA Junko all over again. By the 20-day mark, it was said that Junko could no longer walk due to the excessive beatings she was receiving on a daily basis. She was still being SA'd daily, but not only that, they would hang her up from the ceiling and then use her as a punching bag. She was also forced to ingest excessive amounts of alcohol and sniff paint thinner. The group also mutilated her body, and during the winter months, she was also forced to sleep outside on the balcony completely nude. But not only that, there were other times where they would force her to sit in a freezer for undisclosed amount of times, again without any clothing. And for the most part, they did this because they just wanted to humiliate her. But if that wasn't enough, they also forced her to dance for them while she had no clothes on. And they also forced her to please herself in front of all of them while they just watched and laughed. At some point during the captivity, Junko tried to call for help in order to escape one more time. This time she was able to grab onto a phone and she did dial for emergency services, but unfortunately, the boys saw this and got to her before she could say anything to the operator. They then took the phone from her and they hung it up. But obviously, as you can imagine, this upset them very much, and so they decided that they needed to teach Junko a lesson. As they were about to get this quote-unquote lesson started, the police called back the house, which forced the boys to answer. They knew that if they did not answer the phone, it was likely that a police car would end up coming to the house anyways. So they answer the phone and they reassure the police that it had been an accident, that there was nothing wrong, and with that, they hung up the phone. They then proceeded to pour lighter fluid all over Junko's legs and then set her on fire. Junko helplessly tried to put out the fire as much as she could by herself, but it was no use. She basically just had to wait for the fire to go out on its own. After this, Junko had had absolutely enough. I'm sure a lot of us would have given up by this point, if not earlier. And she was said to have been asking all of her captors to just put her out of her misery and end her life. But in another method of torture, they absolutely refused simply because they were having too much fun. Towards the end of her captivity, Junko's injuries were so atrocious, and it would be fair to say that they had truly broken this little girl's spirit. Junko could apparently no longer breathe through her nose because it was so clogged up with blood. She couldn't keep anything down. She was barely eating. Even drinking water was too much for her to stomach. She had to crawl absolutely everywhere, and even going to the bathroom was an extremely painful process. There was one instance where apparently it took her an hour to drag herself from the bedroom to the bathroom. And we would also later find out through her autopsy that the abuse and torture that she had endured during those 44 days were said to have been so bad and intense that it caused her brain to shrink. Now, leading up towards the end of Junko's life, the final few days that she was at the home, the group apparently had lost interest in her because she no longer resembled the beautiful girl that she was at the beginning of the 44 days. Instead, her face was swollen beyond recognition. She could barely move, and there was a very foul odor that was coming off of her. Now, the main reason these captors had decided to take her was to SA her as much as they wanted to. But by this point, she was no longer physically attractive to them, and so at this point, they no longer wanted to touch her. So they decided that they needed to go after someone else in order to satisfy their primal instincts. The group then decided to kidnap a 19-year-old girl who was also on her way home from work. The group then captured her and took her back to the house where they proceeded to SA her. Except in this instance, they decided to let her go instead of keeping her captive like they did with Junko. On January 4th, 1989, the group then asked Junko to play a game of mahjong against Hiroshi. And surprisingly, she ended up winning. But this was enough to enrage Hiroshi. He did not like losing, and so with that, he decided to punish her all over again. For the next 2 solid hours, the group began to relentlessly beat Junko over and over again. They also forced her to drink her own urine. They poured hot wax over her eyelids, and at one point she had been kicked and punched so hard that she broke out into convulsions. This, though, was not enough to stop the group. If anything, they just simply adjusted their technique. Now, because Junko at this point was bleeding profusely and had various open wounds with blood leaking and pus leaking as well, the group decided to just wrap their hands in plastic bags as gloves in order to continue kicking her and beating her until she could no longer move. Now, when Junko was there on the floor just laying still, the group figured that she likely had just passed out. She had passed out several times before, so they figured that this was just the same thing. However, after 24 hours went by and Junko had not budged, they realized that she was no longer alive. The group then decided to pour fire accelerant all over her body and watched her burn. Once the fire had been put out, they then wrapped her in blankets and then placed her body in a travel bag before placing her in a huge 55-gallon drum and then poured wet concrete into it. But right before they put in the wet concrete, Shinji would later reveal that he had decided to place a videotape of Junko's favorite TV show that she had shared with him while she was being held captive. She had expressed that she regretted not being able to watch the final episode. And so remembering this, Shinji decided to put that episode on a tape and in the bag with her. But not because he felt bad for Junko. It was mainly because he did not want her spirit to come back from the dead and haunt him, which is absolutely disgusting. In a panic, Shinji decided to call his older brother for help because he was afraid of the consequences that would happen to the group. He also called him because he needed help to get rid of Junko. Then around 8 p.m., the group loaded the drum and took it to an isolated area to dump it. So several weeks would go by and there was absolutely no movement. No one had known about what had actually happened to Junko, except when Hiroshi and Joe Ogura were arrested for SA-ing the other 19-year-old girl that they had taken earlier in the story. After she had been released, she had gone to the police to report what had happened to her. A few months later, in March of 1989, the police then went to interrogate both of the men, not just because they had been arrested and implicated in this other case, but also because as they were searching throughout their home, they had discovered women's underwear. So at the time all of this was going on, police were also looking into an unsolved homicide of a different woman whose identity was not clear just yet. Knowing that these two guys had a fairly bad history and that they had just been arrested for SA-ing another woman, they believed that they could have potentially had something to do with this unsolved crime. So when police go to Hiroshi in their interrogation and they ask him about this woman, He was shocked to hear the news, not because he was involved in that woman's case, but because he thought police were referring to what had happened to Junko. He had also made the mistake of believing that Joe Ogura had confessed to the police about what they had done to Junko. Since the men were interrogated separately, they had no way to make sure both of their stories would add up. And so therefore, basically, Hiroshi ended up ratting himself out and his group of friends. He then proceeded to tell authorities where they could find Junko's body. And the following day, Junko was discovered. However, because her body was so poorly disfigured and decomposed by this point, the only way that they could truly identify her was using her fingerprints. Shortly after that, the other two men involved were also arrested, but so was Shinji's older brother for helping them and a few of the other men who had also SA'd Junko over the 44 days. Shockingly though, Shinji's parents were not arrested, even though they knew and did absolutely nothing about it, which is quite shocking to me. I'm not sure how the laws in Japan work or if they've changed since 1988, 1989, but if that were to happen anywhere in Canada or in the States, they would definitely have been arrested for some sort of accessory to the fact. So as the court proceedings began, the identities of the four men were originally sealed because they were all technically underage at the time of the crimes. However, a journalist of a magazine in Japan got hold of their names and decided to make them public because he believed anyone who was able to commit such heinous crimes did not deserve anonymity. Now, in court, it got a little bit complicated. Although the group had caused Junko's death, they all said that they never intended to do so. This resulted in all of them pleading guilty to committing bodily injury that resulted in death, and therefore led to much lighter sentences than anyone expected or even would have liked. Hiroshi would receive 17 years in prison, and of course he was unhappy about this, and so he ended up appealing his sentencing. But when a judge took a closer look at his court documents, he decided that he had been given too light of a sentence and therefore decided to add 3 more years to his sentencing, which made it a total of 20 years in prison. In 2018, Hiroshi was then arrested again for attempting to take the life of another man, and that's where he currently is today, exactly where he belongs, in prison. Yasushi Watanabe was then given 3 to 4 years, but again, because he appealed, the judge took a closer look and then was given an even higher sentence of 5 to 7 years, which is still not close to being enough in my opinion. Joe Ogura received 8 years and was released in 1999, but if you thought that any of these guys felt any sort of remorse, think again. He was known to go around bragging about what the group had done to Junko and essentially how he had gotten away with it. In 2004, Joe Ogura was also arrested for assaulting another man who he thought his girlfriend was having an affair with. He was heard saying that he had taken a life before and that he knew how to do it and that he knew how to get away with it as he was beating this man repeatedly. After his arrest, he was sentenced to 7 more years in prison, but since then he has been released. Now, this part will make you extremely upset if you're not already, but I guess you can say that the apple does not fall far from the tree. It's been reported that Joe Ogura's mother was so upset that her son's life had been ruined by Junko that she went and vandalized Junko's grave. As a form of retribution as well, the judge ordered Hiroshi's family to pay Junko's family a sum equivalent to $370,000 US, which essentially forced them to sell their family home. As for Junko, her funeral took place on April 2nd of 1989, with one of her dearest friends giving a speech that left everyone in tears, wishing her friend well, telling her that there was no more pain now and that she could finally rest in peace. And as for the location where Junko was discovered all those years ago, it was later turned into a park known as Wakusu Park. And that, everyone, is the story of Junko Furuta, a very tragic end to such an innocent and young life. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys think these sentences were way too light? What do you think they should have been charged or even sentenced with? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But other than that, thank you so much for joining me, guys. And if you have any other case suggestions, leave them in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.